Today is the second anniversary of the conflict in Ukraine. Several important books have been written over the last year about the history of this conflict and its causes. And one book I would recommend you read to understand the causes, the consequences of this war, the dimensions of this war is Richard Sakwa's The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. It was published in 2023, late in 2023, and I read Sakwa's The Lost Peace recently. It deepened my understanding of this war and also my own responses to this war. Sakwa's view is that the failure to prevent a second Cold War is tragic, has led to more catastrophic, tragic outcomes than the first Cold War. He writes, unlike the earlier struggle, the second Cold War in 2022 turned into a proxy war between Russia and the political West over Ukraine. It's estimated now that there are more than 500,000, perhaps over 1 million deaths as a result of this war. Moreover, this war carries with it the ever-present concern that it will spill over into World War III and nuclear annihilation. It has also had cultural, diplomatic, and economic consequences all around the world. And tragically, it did not need to happen. It arose from decisions by all sides, not just over the last 3 years, but over the last 3 decades. Sakwa writes, this is a story that begins in hope but ends in unmitigated tragedy in both the classical and modern senses. There was a positive peace to be had after 1989, but it was squandered. Sakwa's reference to 1989 is to the brief period between 1986 and 1990 when, on the initiative of Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, the two superpowers that had glowered at each other across the Iron Curtain of Eastern Europe abandoned their most hostile rhetoric, Star Wars, and capitalist imperialists, and negotiated an end to the Cold War. Those negotiations led to significant nuclear disarmament agreements and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Gorbachev hoped that NATO would do the same and declared so in the United Nations. He hoped for a new era of peaceful development across the world in what he described as a multipolar world. In his own country, Gorbachev brought glasnost, perestroika, and a form of democracy to the Soviet Union. But his actions also destabilized the system and ultimately contributed to the astonishing collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In America, Ronald Reagan was succeeded by George H.W. Bush, the senior, and Bush to some degree befriended and admired Gorbachev. But at critical points, when Gorbachev appealed for political, diplomatic, and financial aid from the West to make the Soviet Union a normal country, Bush let his friend down. The story of the collapse of the Soviet Union is told brilliantly in Vladislav Zubok's The Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union from 2022. He writes in his elegiac conclusion of this brilliant book, there was no political will or imagination among Western leaders to seize the unprecedented and historic opportunity to consolidate democracy in Russia. That is the tragedy of the lost peace that Richard Sakwa is referring to. The books of both Zubok and Sakwa have helped me sort through my own memories, thoughts, and emotions about this 35-year path from hope to tragedy. I recall those years of the late 1980s when Gorbachev gave hope to millions, really millions around the world, that we did not have to live under the shadow of nuclear war. We did not have to define ourselves by loyalty to one or other ideological bloc. We did not have to see the world through the distorted lens of us versus them. I had no nostalgia for the Soviet Union, socialism or communism, for reasons I cannot really account for. I had since the mid-1970s read or become aware of the novels of Solzhenitsyn and the work of Soviet bloc dissidents like Václav Havel, Solidarity, and Charter 77. It was not an ideological sadness that I felt when the Soviet Union fell, but a cultural connection that gave me an empathy for the peoples of the former Soviet Union and for Russian culture, history, and literature. As the tragedy of the lost peace unfolded dramatically over the next 30 years, including through the social catastrophe of the 1990s in these states, I always felt these people do not deserve this, and these events could have unfolded in a different way. Richard Sakwa, The Lost Peace, gives precision and scholarship to those sentiments. Who is Richard Sakwa? Sakwa is a leading scholar of Russian and post-Soviet state politics. He is the Emeritus Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent, and he has a distinguished record of publications. His book, Frontline Ukraine from 2015, is essential reading to understand the background to the current conflict. He displays throughout The Lost Peace admirable objectivity and balance. He focuses the story of The Lost Peace on two ideas of world order. On the one hand, there is the charter system, referring to the United Nations Charter of 1945. And on the other hand is the liberal universalist system, which refers to the idea of the liberal rules-based order supported by Western powers with growing passion since 1989. Sakwa tells the story of the lost peace in 3 acts. In part 1, from Cold War to Hot War, he recounts the years of hope when Gorbachev and many peace activists in the West thought there would be a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. He recalls the proposals that Gorbachev and later both Yeltsin and Putin made and how they were responded to by the USA and the European Union. This story takes us through the growing conflict between the two ideas of world order, all the way to Russia's proposals for a new European security framework in 2021. Real dialogue between the Charter and the liberal universalist systems was never fully established, and this failure paved the road to the Ukraine war. In part 2, Great Power Conflict, Sakwa reviews the positions on the Ukraine war and the differing ideas of world order, the different processes of peace of the major powers in the world. He examines the challenge for America in defining a role of leadership, whether as primacy, being number one, or some more modest aim as America's relative weight in the world recedes. He examines China's growing global role and its increasingly assertive ideas of processes for peace and multilateral negotiation between states, including the global south. He examines Russia, his deep speciality, and he examines the European Union. In part 3, War and International Politics, he examines the breakdown in arms control agreements between Russia and the United States of America and the escalating tensions that preceded the war in Ukraine, first in 2014 and then with greater intensity from 2022. Sakwa condemns the war and examines it in overview, and he focuses his analysis on the crisis of the international system that conditioned the war and escalated after the war. Finally, he examines the rise of what he calls the political East, looking in particular at how China, India, and the global South have responded diplomatically to this conflict in ways the West did not expect, but that do suggest more commitment to the process of peace embedded in the charter system idea of world order rather than the international rules-based order idea of world order. Sakwa concludes his book by writing, "The proximate cause of renewed Cold War was the failure to create some sort of enduring and inclusive structure of European security. The Atlantic powers did not set out deliberately to humiliate and marginalize the country, but there was no place for Russia in the new order. The slide into Cold War II thus became a tragedy in the classical sense, in which people of good intent become the victims of their own fate." Sakwa's polite, scholarly constraint aids understanding, which is so important in a debate in which there is too little preparedness to listen to other different points of view. Ultimately, the diplomats and world leaders of the world will need to find their way to some new compromise of the Charter and liberal universalist idea or ideas of world order. We in the West will need to learn to live in a world in which the West no longer calls all the shots. But if, like me, you are a mere citizen of the multipolar world and have no real capacity to influence these grand events, what can you do? Keep an open mind, explore the perspectives of other parties, and read Richard Sakwa's The Lost Peace. That way we may all together slowly rediscover the lost hope of peace. Thanks for watching. You might also like this video right here.